Hello, my name is Brandon Nguyen, and this is my GEO3452 final video presentation for Dr. Hamerlick's Intro to Medical Geography class. Today's presentation will be about stroke. What is a stroke? Well, a stroke is an interruption of blood flow to the brain which, if not treated quickly, can cause permanent brain damage and even death. There are two types of strokes, ischemic strokes and hemorrhagic strokes. Ischemic strokes are due to the blockage of arteries leading to the brain, perhaps due to a blood clot or other particulate matters within the blood. However, hemorrhagic strokes are due to the internal bleeding of a brain after a blood vessel has bursted. Typically, a blood vessel bursts due to hypertension or other related symptoms. The first recorded case of a stroke was reported in Persia in the 2nd millennium BCE. However, Hippocrates is credited with the first complete description of a stroke when he observed sudden paralysis partnered with ischemia, a reduction of blood flow to the tissues. According to the CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there are many symptoms of a stroke. However, these are the common ones. Sudden numbness of the face or limb, especially only on one side. Sudden confusion, trouble speaking, or difficulty understanding speech. Impairment of senses such as loss of balance or even coordination. And a sudden headache with no apparent cause. A good way to remember these symptoms is the acronym FAST. F is for face drooping. Sudden numbness of the face is a clear indicator that someone is having a stroke. A is for arm weakness. If someone has a stroke, you may ask them to lift up their arm, but if they cannot hold it up for long, it may be a sign that they're having a stroke. S is for speech difficulty. Due to the lack of blood flow to the brain cannot operate efficiently and thus will have trouble speaking and understanding speech. And T is for time to call 911. If someone you know is showing all these symptoms, they may be having a stroke and time is of the essence. Call 911 immediately. Strokes kill about 140,000 Americans each year, approximately 1 in 20 of all deaths that occur throughout the year. In total, about 795,000 Americans will experience a stroke in a given year. In fact, strokes cost the United States an estimated $73.7 billion every year. The southeastern region of the United States has an above-average mortality rate relating to strokes. These include southern states such as Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, Alabama, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, West Virginia, and both of the Carolinas. These states together form the stroke belt of the United States. Also, based on a study done by the Lancet, Eastern Asia and parts of Southeast Asia have stroke as the leading cause of lost years of life. The Lancet defines lost years of life as the number of years short a life is ended before it reaches the average life expectancy of that country or region. This is identical to the definition of years of productive lives lost in Module 14. Today, I would like to talk to you about this specific GIS study that I have found and analyzed. The journal it comes from is from the BMC Public Health, and the title is Neighborhood Disparities in Stroke and Myocardial Infarction Mortality, a GIS and Spatial Scan Statistics Approach. Its authors include Ashley Padigo, Tim Aldrich, and Agricola Odoi. This was published on August 12, 2011. To begin, the researchers wanted to examine the relationship between demographic clusters and the likelihood of dying to a stroke or similar disease. This can be broken down into two vertices on the human ecology triangle. The first vertex is the population vertex. They wanted to determine if demographic trends such as socioeconomic status or educational attainment contributed to the spatial distribution of stroke deaths. The second vertex of the human ecology triangle that the researchers implemented within their study is the habitat vertex. They wanted to observe if stroke deaths were clustered within certain neighborhoods or evenly dispersed throughout the region. The study also mentions other factors of stroke, such as race, geography, and prevalence of other chronic diseases, but it does not go too in-depth into these topics. Next, let's move on to their methodology. They identified stroke mortality cases and then subsequently identified their addresses of where they lived when they were alive. Since the disease was identified first, and then their exposure, i.e. location, later through historical records, this study would be classified as a retrospective cohort study. This would not be a case control study, because there were no controls identified within the study. And it would not be a cross-sectional study either, because the mortality incidences occurred over a period of almost 10 years, meaning that it's not a quote-unquote snapshot in time, like a cross-sectional study is. The researchers focused on a study area of 11 counties within the Eastern Tennessee Appalachian region. They obtained mortality data from the Tennessee Department of Health regarding deaths from 1997 to 2007. They then identified the deaths due to stroke and omitted any deaths not attributed to such. Afterwards, they determined the exposure within the state using records from the Tennessee Department of Health. However, it is important to note that they only successfully determined the address of each of the deaths for about 94% of the cases, meaning that 6% was left unknown. To sort the information, the researchers found the age-adjusted median stroke risk for the study area, and they found it to be 55.6 deaths per 100,000 people. Using this data, they used GIS to map out high-risk areas that saw higher than average stroke deaths. These areas in Figure 1 are denoted as darker, more opaque regions, such as the Jefferson, Granger, Greene, Cocke, Hambyon, and Knox counties. They then calculated the relative risk of each neighborhood within those counties. Areas with high relative risk are labeled on the map in Figure 2. As you can see, the counties I mentioned earlier are the ones that are most at risk. Furthermore, the maps on the right exemplify several trends, such as the clustering patterns that we saw earlier. And although not stroke itself, the study did say that myocardial infarction death rates follow similar clustering patterns, as you can see in Figure 3. An important difference to note is that even though myocardial infarction and stroke are very similar in how they occur, myocardial infarction death rates differ from stroke death rates, as you can see in the maps to the right. In the top left corner of Figure 1, you can see that Claiborne County, while having a high clustering of stroke deaths, does not have a death rate similar to those in the center. In fact, it is much less. However, when you look at Figure 3, you can see that Claiborne County has an extremely high myocardial infarction death rate compared to the rest of the counties. As seen earlier, Figure 2 denotes the relative risks calculated by the researchers. They omitted relative risks in counties that implied lower than average stroke deaths in order to focus more on the clustering. Significant tests were performed and found p-values of less than 0.005, and it can be seen in Table 1. Researchers didn't want to solely find out the clustering of stroke deaths within these counties and neighborhoods. They wanted to see how the demographics also affected it. So, through surveys, they identified various factors and traits relevant to the study to observe. For example, through the lens of educational attainment, there seems to be a positive association between low educational attainment and the likelihood of dying due to a stroke. As seen in the table below, Table 2, the researchers also considered race and a description of living densities as factors within the study. Besides the positive association between low educational attainment and the likelihood of dying to a stroke, the researchers also found that people living in rural areas and areas with a high proportion of African Americans were also likely to experience higher than average stroke death rates. This study found a positive information about this study is that they only looked at a few counties in eastern Tennessee. What they should do is compare to multiple different counties in many other states to see if there is a correlation. Also, due to the heterogeneity of the studied area, the smaller populations can have more variance, which can skew the data. And furthermore, not all stroke deaths had addresses that were capable of being located, indicating that the information was incomplete. In conclusion, this study found a positive association between low educational attainment and the likelihood of dying from a stroke. They also found that stroke deaths tended to cluster within specific neighborhoods, and they used this as proof of using GIS to aid planners in appropriately assessing and identifying spatial disparities in at-risk populations.